I call Michael Wood.
Oh, Mr Chair, thank you. Delighted to take a call on this very important piece of legislation. As I walked into the chamber not that long ago, Mr Chris Bishop shouted out the words outrageous, and I wasn't sure if he was commenting on my entry into this debate or on the comments of one of my other colleagues, or it was a comment in relation to one of the leadership aspirants in the National Party today. But I don't think this bill is outrageous at all. I think this bill is actually a very, very important piece of legislation, and the government's very pleased to be getting on with the job and putting it forward today. And I think we've heard previously that this is a bill that languished in Select Committee for some time back in 2016, and actually there's a degree of urgency in proceeding with it. The bill, of course, amends the Dairy Industry Restructuring Amendment Bill, and that bill came about in 2001 under the previous Labor government and enabled the formation of Fonterra. And this goes to actually the very heart and the very purpose of what we're talking about, because why was that bill required to enable the formation of Fonterra in the first instance? And the chief reason that it was required was because Fonterra acts essentially in a monopsonist manner, in that it is not quite a single buyer, but an extremely dominant buyer of a very important commodity product within our economy. And the normal competition laws that are in place wouldn't necessarily allow for such a company structure to form. And so we needed a special piece of legislation to allow for it. And when this House makes those sorts of decisions, we need to put in place certain protections to ensure that that market power, which is handed in this case to Fonterra, has some checks and balances on it, and that we don't entirely eliminate the potential for companies to enter that market and create a degree of competition and a degree of innovation. And so the situation that we find ourselves in is that that original bill put in place certain provisions which created those checks and those balances. But there were essentially sunset clauses put in there which said that when we get below a certain threshold, those provisions will no longer be in effect. And that was passed last year. And so what happened at that point is the Commerce Commission had to undertake a review, and what they found, this is really, really important, that's why we have to get this piece of legislation through, is that, I'm quoting from the regulatory impact statement here, the current state of competition is not yet sufficient to ensure the efficient and contestable operation of dairy markets in the absence of the dairy regulatory regime. And so that is why we need this piece of legislation, to ensure that we have those protections while we get on with the broader business of looking at what the longer-term regulatory regime might be and whether it is in fact possible to move to more of a deregulated situation. But of course we want to be cautious in that area, because if we remove those regulations while there is not sufficient competition within the industry, we have a lack of competition, we have a lack of innovation, we have a lack of protection for some of those smaller players who may well have good things to contribute within the dairy market. And so the bill itself is a reasonably short piece of legislation, and Part 1 essentially relates to sections 147 to 150 of the primary legislation. And the particular provisions that we want to ensure are kept in place to ensure that we have a degree of competition within the industry relate to, I'm just finding here, relate to having an oversight of what is happening within the sector essentially. And we're talking in particular about the South Island. And the key things that we want to see in place are having an open entry and exit regime. So Fonterra must accept applications from a shareholding farmer in Fonterra and must accept supply of milk from that shareholder. There's a milk price monitoring regime, and that's effectively ensuring that the regime that we have in place, which has Fonterra as a very dominant receiver of milk, a very dominant buyer, doesn't result in milk prices being too high. And this is really important, the 20% rule. And that allows Fonterra farmers, so farmers who are signed up with Fonterra, to sell up to 20% of their milk production to another processor each season. And that to me is probably the critical part of this, which allows space for smaller suppliers who might otherwise be squeezed out by a very, very dominant buyer to have a place in the market, to get a toehold, to be able to innovate, to be able to give good service, to those farmers, and also to keep Fonterra on its toes. So, Mr Chair, this piece of legislation does need to go through so that we can ensure that degree of competition and innovation remains in this very important industry, which makes up 40% of agricultural exports. Thank you, Mr Chair.
I call